Police officers of Reddit, what are you thinking when you see cases like George Floyd? For all the police officers here, what would the charges be if one of the bystanders pulled the police officer off of the poor guy? Assault on a police officer, obstruction of justice, and probably resisting arrest, depending on state laws of course, that gets tossed in as an easy one to charge, but usually gets pled off in court. I fear that if someone had intervened, that version of the story never would have received publicity. Death is a much more weighty headline. It's hard to intervene when there's no visible precedent of it being effective, and there is a strong precedent of reactive brutality. I wish we had positive stories available on the news in which de-escalation worked, but in a similar way to flattening the curve, it's so much harder to count saved lives than lost ones. You'd see it on r/justice served with the title "Idiot Tries to Interfere with Arrest, Gets Wrecked." Also, what would happen to a cop if they intervened or pushed the cop off of him? They would never work as a cop again. I'm a former police officer, and so have had plenty of training in physical restraint of individuals being arrested. There is no police academy training officers to kneel on someone's neck to subdue them. That's how you kill a person. There is extensive training on how to avoid seriously injuring a person while restraining them, and I guarantee you every one of these officers was trained to never strike a person in the neck or choke them. The officer who killed him is very clearly liable for manslaughter at the very least, and I think the other officers who stood by have some accountability as well, because they knew damn well that was not how you handle a person, and should have stepped up. Here's my question. Given that this officer was actively killing a man, through an illegal use of force, what would have happened had a non-police officer stopped him? Granted, then the outcome wouldn't have killed the man, and thus there would have been no death to show that the use of force was obviously excessive. But that's the part that really makes me angry. Anyone who would have tried to stop this would have been arrested on the spot for assaulting an officer, even though the officer was literally murdering another human being. Lawyer here. While the literal text of most justification/necessity defenses would apply to using force in that situation, most likely the Good Samaritan would be charged with obstruction or interference with public duties. They would then have to convince a jury that there was no other reasonable recourse short of physical force. That's a tall order, and I'd be real nervous for my client. In a worst-case scenario, our hypothetical Samaritan gets tossed or shot or killed for their troubles. My thoughts? Record and verbally demand the officer stop is probably the wisest course. But that is exactly what happened, and clearly the end result is that the cop didn't stop and someone died. The wisest course, because unfortunately a more interfering action may get you seriously hurt or killed. Yeah, those situations don't often have win-win endings, unfortunately. Exactly. I saw some comments ripping up the bystanders, saying they're cowards and just as guilty for just watching. I swear some people don't understand that sometimes every option is a loss. Yeah, attacking an armed murderer whose armed friends are close by. What could go wrong with that? Exactly. It'd be a damn shame if the recorder got shot by accident, and they had to confiscate the phone as evidence. Who knows, maybe the phone gets destroyed and the recording is permanently lost. There is no police academy training officers to kneel on someone's neck to subdue them. That's how you kill a person. This is why it's quite apparent the officer had intent to end the guy's life. Any sane person, officer or not, would not have wanted to kill someone over what that guy did in the last 10 minutes of interaction. The officer had the eyes of someone who wouldn't think twice about the value of the man he's causing to lose consciousness. Absolutely sick to my stomach. I'm a lieutenant in my hometown police department. I started my day by showing the video to my officers and making sure my people understood that this is murder, plain and simple. You never, outside of a life and death struggle, do anything like this. George Floyd was handcuffed and on the ground. If he was still struggling badly enough that they felt a need to hold him down, there's 100 ways to do it safely. Use of force should always be as measured and considered as possible. There will always be times where an officer sees danger and has to make a split-second decision without the luxury of weighing the consequences. That clearly was not the case here. He had all the time in the world to think about what he was doing. He had multiple people there telling him to stop. And none of his fellow officers intervened. All of that is why I find this incident particularly disgusting. They had so many chances to do the right thing. Luckily, I have the fortune of working with good people who see this shit for what it is. Before the video was over, before I told them that George Floyd died because of this, my officers were muttering things like, "What the fuck is he doing? You can't do that shit and he needs to get off the man's fucking neck." Made me way prouder to be their leader than any number of arrests they could make to see that their instincts were not to defend the officer. For what it's worth, I'm glad that they were fired. I've heard mention in this thread that one of the officers has been arrested, which is great if true. I hope they're all brought to justice. Their actions, and lack thereof, were completely unconscionable. That's the part that gets to me. His fellow officers did nothing. I have a friend who was in the police force. He had been at the hospital visiting a fellow officer dying of cancer, then went on shift. He was trying to get some kids to leave an area they were in illegally, and these children were being verbally aggressive and physically by snapping wet towels at him. In a momentary lapse of reason, he pulled his gun. I've watched the video. As soon as his gun came out, 3 officers were there pushing his hand down and saying no. He put the gun away, turned around, went home and resigned. Bad day, bad decision. He knew he had fucked up. You could see the instant he realized how screwed he was and realized how badly he screwed up. But, if his fellow officers hadn't stepped in, would his anger have been enough to shoot a teenager? We'll never know, because his fellow officers did the right thing. Retired after 28 years. Nothing less than murder. All the guys I worked with would never have considered doing something like that. You treat combative in custodies once they're secured as human beings. Nothing should be personal. Once they've been subdued and you are safe as an officer, you stand him up, pat him down and understand that your arrestee is at a low point in his life. Give him some dignity and you'll generally get his respect. It works 90+% of the time. That man was subdued and nobody should have been on him at that point. The key phrase I keep hearing/reading in these cases, whether bad cop directly suffocates/strangles someone or fibrillates their heart with a taser, or cracks their skull, or maybe didn't touch them at all, is, "I can't breathe." Seems to me that this phrase should be an automatic emergency ambulance ride. You shouldn't look at someone who is having difficulty breathing, and then, for example, sit on them, on top of hot asphalt. You get them medical attention before they drop dead. That is, if you don't want them to die. Not a local, I'm a Fed. 5 years into the job. George Floyd was murdered and it's fucking disgusting. We're trained that anything involving the neck is a no-go and is considered deadly force. We were also trained that if you make an arrest in a prone position, you search and then immediately move them onto their side or a seated position because the risk of asphyxiation is so great. If a suspect says they can't breathe, believe them and take measures to correct to it. This training is reinforced at least twice a year in our use of force training. These officers deserve to spend the rest of their lives in prison. I'm a police officer in California. I am absolutely disgusted by the officers' actions. When someone is in our custody, you must treat them properly. I don't care if they are arrested for murder or forgery. They are a human with a story and they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. I had tears streaming down my face watching the video of George Floyd. We swore to protect our communities and that's what we set out to do every day. Putting a knee into the neck of a handcuffed man for an extended period of time isn't protecting. A man has lost his life due to the gross negligence of an evil person. May he rest in peace. Cop here. Disgusted. There are 1,000 reasons why this shouldn't have happened. Simple, easy, steps that should have been taken. Lessons that policing has learned over the past 200 years and basic things taught in every academy. Make no mistake, this was murder. Maybe not premeditated murder, but nonetheless murder. I will be angry if those officers do not get indicted. He's apparently been involved in at least 2 other deaths, including shooting a fleeing suspect in the back. I don't know, given that history, premeditation seems reasonable. That is inexcusable. I was a cop in the military. In the police academy, this was one of the things that taught us not to do, as it could crush the windpipe. The only time I was ever taught to use chokes and neck holds was in combat training for deployments. But when we got back, we always had to attend retraining classes to relearn what we can do stateside. As a son of a former police officer, my dad worked really hard to be an honest cop. His department was full of racists. They didn't like him because he was a decent cop. They couldn't do anything wrong on front of him. We saw the news together and I saw him wipe a tear, but tried really hard to hide it. I know he's sad and I don't want to push him to talk about it, but we both know things like this is always gonna happen, and that is a really sad fact. I can't possibly understand why a human being would do something like this. I was a Marine musician. Yeah, the Marine Corps has banned nerds. At one point I got punished for failure to follow orders. I wasn't practicing the required amount. Confined to quarters and work for 2 weeks, forfeited 2 weeks' pay. I was held to higher standards and punished more harshly for fucking up a SOSA march than many cops face for killing someone. We gotta look out for each other is for surviving combat, not avoiding accountability. I worked in a place where the population was about 75% black. As a white cop, I very quickly learned a lot about being respectful and how to be tactful. Humor goes a long way, and it's very important not to give off any sign of being fearful. They can sense it. You get used to shouts of abuse as you drive by, and guys on the corner will try to provoke you by openly drinking beer. Is it illegal? Yes, but you learn to pick your battles. If you do ever need to stop someone and question them, you know that if you take too long, you will suddenly find yourself surrounded by an angry crowd who have no idea what you are asking. People in these areas are almost always reluctant to even be seen conversing with a cop out of fear of being seen as a snitch. It is true that if you do need to make an arrest, there will almost always be some level of resistance, which makes things very difficult, as once you have made the commitment to make the arrest, you have to go through with it. I am not in any way making excuses for the cops in this particular video, but it isn't easy. However, the cop with his knee on the poor guy appears to be of the alpha male type of cop. These guys are bullies by nature and very difficult to work with if you personally police to different standards. It's very difficult to intervene as a partner, as you will likely be ostracized. You take this route and your career is over. Your social life is over. Your marriage will have problems, as cop families are pretty close. Interesting last paragraph. Thanks for your perspective. Let's stay safe and come together to fight racism and brutality. Since we're tapping into the police community here, can someone please explain what, if anything, the bystanders could have done to help George Floyd? Call 911 and report police brutality. In all seriousness, what is the preventative action here, since none of the police officers on the scene, 4 of which were physically restraining him, reacted to his being murdered right in front of them? Edit. Thank you u/murder by modem for this link ACLU. I'm adding it to my post because I think others will appreciate it and I don't want it to get lost. Edit. In summary, some of the options proposed are below. I apologize if I omitted, misrepresented, or oversimplified anything. The bystanders in this case did many of these things, and they were a voice for George when he couldn't speak for himself. 1. Always record the incident, live streaming if possible, and inform the police they are being recorded. 2. Involve other authorities when applicable, such as police supervisors, state police, 911, ask for supervisor and an ambulance to report immediately, ACLU, FBI. Tell the officers on site that you are involving other authorities. 3. De-escalation, back any crowd or bystanders away from the scene and officers, while still being able to record the incident. Have one person, preferably a white person, attempt to approach the officer, S, as a medical professional or voice of reason to explain that it appears that medical treatment may be required and remind the officer, S, that their best interests, career, family, reputation etc., are to act responsibly. 4. Create a diversion/distraction that requires the officers to release the hold, not custody, of anyone in imminent medical danger. 5. Physically remove the threat imposed by the officer, S, by force. This includes exercising your right to carry and discharge a gun. I think everyone agrees that this option will most likely result in physical, potentially fatal, and legal ramifications for the individual, S, involved unless the group of bystanders are organized enough and outnumber the officers on the scene to the extent that they can safely take control without further harm. 6. Systemic change, vote, local and national, for people that value human life and will implement change to protect it. This is not an anti-gun sentiment. If you value your right to carry a gun, then vote for people that support that. Be vocal in demanding justice when these incidents occur. Push for improved training, hiring practices, and accountability within the police force. I would imagine that this may also include increasing pay for the police force to attract more suitable individuals into the positions. Possibly implement a citizen-based governing body to oversee the police force and their actions.